I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though this body be destroyed, yet shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not as a stranger. The souls of the righteous are in the hand of God. They are in peace, and their hope is full of immortality. Rest eternal give to them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. Welcome, each and every one of you, here to Memorial Church on behalf of the Parker family and Harvard University. We've come here to remember and celebrate the life of a remarkable man and a gifted coach and teacher. It's always moving when you see so many people gathered for a memorial service to pay their respects. I know many of you have come from great distances to be here. It's a testament to the lives that he touched. It's a testament to how Harry touched your life, that you are all here today. Now, Harry was not a religious man in the conventional sense of the word. I remember asking him at one point senior year about church. He mentioned that he grew up in a Methodist church, but left it at that. And surprisingly, I couldn't squeeze any more out of him. I always suspected that rowing and being on the water were how Harry found his spiritual connections. But even though Harry was not religious, we gather here in this church as a testament to our common heritage and to the heritage of this institution. The Congregationalists who founded Harvard College called their worship spaces meeting houses. And indeed, those meeting houses were used for every type of communal event. They became places where the very soul of the community found its expression. Ever since President Lowell built this church, it has served a similar function, as a place to worship God, yes, but also as a place to honor the sacred and to express a part of our community's soul. Today, we gather to remember a great figure of Harvard. Harry was a part of this institution for more than 50 years, something that this day and age is incredibly rare. He dedicated his life to the education of Harvard's sons and daughters through sport, and he left an indelible mark on so many. In the best tradition of Harvard, Harry was a giant in his chosen field of endeavor. He is a part of the Harvard Pantheon, a part of its history. And we are also here to mourn, to be with one another, and to support Harry's family. In that spirit, I would ask you now to join me in a time of prayer. Whether or not you believe in God, you can acknowledge that there are times when we should look beyond ourselves, and this is one of those times. So let us pray. Holy God, whose ways are not our ways, and whose thoughts are not our thoughts, grant that your Holy Spirit may intercede for us with sighs too deep for words. Heal our wounded hearts, made heavy by sorrow. Through the veil of our tears and the silence of our emptiness, assure us again that ear has not heard, nor eye seen, nor human imagination envisioned what you have prepared for those who love you. Amen. And now I'd invite you all to please rise as you are able as we join in singing the Navy hymn, which recognizes Harry's service to his country and also his love of mucking about in boats. Eternal Father, strong to save.
Good afternoon. My name is George Parker. I am the oldest son of Harry Parker, whose life we are gathered here to remember and celebrate. For those of you who rode this morning, I think it is obvious, even though we are here in this beautiful church on what could be a sad occasion, this is a great day. I have the honor of reading a brief passage selected by my father, but I would like to take a moment to offer a few thoughts on my father and this reading. My father was born and raised in the blue-collar world of East Hartford, Connecticut. He said very little about his childhood, except to make it clear that he did not grow up in a happy household. As far as I know, he kept no photos or mementos of his childhood, not even his high school yearbook. But with the wonder of the internet, all things can be found. And I found my father's high school yearbook online, and through it, I had a glimpse of the world my father grew up in. From what I know of my father, when he arrived as a freshman in the Navy ROTC program at the University of Pennsylvania, he might well have been described as highly motivated, competitive, and smart. If these words sound familiar, you can find them at the back of your program in my father's description of his athletes as they arrive at Harvard. You will find support for these characteristics in my father's high school yearbook as well. The saying given to him by the yearbook staff read, "Not but perfection shall be my goal." So I think that covers the highly motivated part. The competitive part, well, I think that's well understood by everyone in this building and in the rowing community. I would just offer that when I was growing up, the Parker family often played Monopoly. After several years of typically losing to Dad, my brother David and I came to a tacit understanding that the only way for either of us to win at Monopoly would be to refuse to trade with Dad. Because he typically persuaded us to make trades that did not work out well for us. After we adopted that strategy, we didn't play Monopoly much. And as for smart, well, Dad was the president of the National Honor Society in high school. So my father left East Hartford and came to Penn, where he discovered rowing. You would not have predicted his success at rowing from his high school athletic career. As far as I can tell, he was an undistinguished member of varsity baseball and basketball teams that were not terribly successful. In his junior year, the basketball team did not win a single game. Dad once observed I had the distinction of being the lowest scoring center in the history of the school. But he found something magical in rowing. As he said in 2012, as soon as I started at rowing, I had the feeling that it held this wonderful, great sense of power. You can harness the strength in your body and make the boat move. And if you do it really well and the boat responds, it is quite exciting. My father also found that rowing worked to his personal strengths. As he told an interviewer, you have to work hard, you have to be responsible, you have to be accountable, you have to have a lot of perseverance, and you have to deal with a lot of frustration. Basically, it's hard work. My father also found at Penn, in the person of Joe Burke, the head rowing coach, a father figure. So my father found in rowing a place where he belonged, where he could excel, where he was part of a community, and where he was part of a family. My father's time at Penn was formative, but it was his experience here at Harvard that in many ways defined him. For it was here, over 53 years, that he truly became the father figure of the Harvard rowing program, which is why so many of you are here today in this place, including all but a handful of his 51 varsity captains. My father was very proud of Harvard rowing and all that it stood for. One measure of its importance to him is that on Thursday, just 2 days ago, at his specific request, we spread his ashes at Red Top, the iconic symbol of Harvard rowing. My father became an integral part of the Harvard community over the decades and was very proud to have been awarded the Harvard Medal for extraordinary service to the university at commencement in 2012. and he became a leading member of the national and international rowing community, including the Henley Royal Regatta, which is a very long way indeed from the blue-collar world of East Hartford, where my father grew up. So when he chose this passage from George Santayana to be read, first at his wedding to Kathy in 1985, and then for this memorial service, I think it reflected both his deep appreciation for the sport of rowing and for what it had provided to him throughout his life. What is there in the world more fascinating than running water and the possibility of moving over it? What better image of existence and possible triumph? Thank you.
I've been here 27 years, and I remember my interview with Harry. I was 26 years old, and as his mother-in-law told me a few days ago, he didn't expect it to last long. And I still don't know quite what to think of that. But what Harry expected to spend 20 minutes ended up being 3 hours. And it was a thrilling time for me, left me feeling like maybe I could come to Harvard, and the phone call came several weeks later, and I've been here since. Kathy asked me, in those 27 years have passed, in a snap. It's remarkable. And Kathy, and a big part of that was life with Harry at the boathouse. And Kathy asked me to say a few things about the fun that he had. And so I'm going to discuss or give you a snapshot of several days of my life with Harry, just a few moments in them. But before I go on to the fun, I want to describe to you an astonishing story for me. He spent time periodically in the hospital in the last 2 years, and I'd go in to see him. And he'd say, "Charlie, hand me that bag." I'd hand him the bag, and he'd pull out a letter. And oarsmen from years and years had written him letters. And a lot of it was the great day. And they could see that Harry had lived the great day. And I know from my association with him in an office the size of this pew that he did live the great day. And the astonishing story that I want to share with you was a letter from the bowman of the 1964 pair width from the Tokyo Olympics. And he said, "Harry, I owe my gold medal to you." I said, "Harry, what in the world is he talking about?" Well, Harry, as a young coach on the dock at the 1964 Olympics, organized, nobody went on the water for the next race. They were on the dock, and he was part of the group that organized the regattas coming to a stop, because there was an awful lot of upset amongst the oarsmen about how the races were going down and the course at the moment. And Harry said, "I don't know." I said, "Harry, how did you manage to do this? What were you thinking?" He says, "I don't know what I was thinking, really, besides that I had to do something." And Con Finley, a bear of a man, the biggest man of his generation, said, "Parker, you better know what you're doing." Tommy Keller came down on the dock. Said, "What is going on here?" The regatta was delayed for several hours, and it improved the regatta, and it gave more crews chances in that particular regatta. And I was amazed by this and thankful that I was able to learn it in those last 2 years, and it came from a letter. So now I'm going to move on to the fun part of the last 27 years and what I recall from it. There was a morning, as I described last night to a group, where Harry came to the door yelling, "Charlie, Charlie, come here." So I rushed out from the desk, and we went quickly across the floor. It was a cold morning, and there was a hawk, had alighted on a flagpole. And I thought, well, that's a hawk and it's beautiful. He says, no, look at the rat on the dock. And I said, oh, okay. So we're watching the rat, or we're watching the hawk watch the rat. And the hawk disappointed Harry because he let the rat scurry off. But I remember that moment thinking, this is fun, this is interesting. And I think you'll realize there was a rat problem at the boathouse at the time, but Harry and the boatman, Charlie, had killed a rat in the shop. And they got the idea to use the intercom. This is, for the young people here, there was a time when there weren't phones, that you could just, and you call your mom up from the kitchen, anyway, so they used an intercom. Charlie, come down. We got something to show you. And there was no window in the door, so I throw the door open. I'm 2 strides in. I'm 26 years old, and there's a rat right there on my foot. And I jumped and screamed, and they had a great time laughing. Now, Harry had a laugh where he would roll, he'd hold his back like this, and his eyes would be closed, and so I didn't mind at the time. This was an iconic figure, and somebody I had known, actually my mother, who's 89, who can't be here today, said, I knew Harry when he was a boy. And this is just what the world was like, guys, in the 1950s. But in 55 or 56, the Sprints, there was a flood, and the hotel Penn was staying in was flooded. So they had to live with people in the rowing community. And Harry was one of 3 Penn boys who stayed with my mom and dad in 1956. So she told me that recently. So that's something I'm proud of. I wasn't alive, but I'm still proud of it. So now, Harry said one day, Charlie, let's go up to 60 JFK. That's the old athletic offices. And I had some mimeographing to do, or he had me doing some mimeographing. So I'm standing there, and I'm working away, and Harry's chatting with an administrator across the floor from Jack Reardon's office. So Jack Reardon's office door swings open, and out steps the hockey coach, an iconic figure. And he looks at me and goes, he gets on all fours. And he's going like this. And Jean McIver's watching and just kind of shaking her head like this. And I didn't know why at the time. And the young administrator is watching as the hockey coach comes across. And I said, well, this is interesting. This is an iconic hockey coach sneaking up on an iconic rowing coach. And he got him on the ankle and barked. And Harry just jumped like this. And which is when I realized he may have been a good center as a rebounder, but not, and that's when I thought for my first time that maybe I'm going to like Harvard. So now I have a little prop with me, and you may think it's strange that I have a Pinewood Derby car, and it's an ugly thing, isn't it? It's anyone can see it at the T later, but I want to explain why it's significant that I'm holding this at Harry Parker's memorial speech, or talk rather. Harry was, as Eleanor said, obsessed by the Pinewood Derby. George Parker talks about how it was at the Pinewood Derby that his cars would win, and how ugly the car was, but it would still win, and how much of a thrill that was. So my own sons were building Pinewood Derbies, and I thought I was being pretty clever by studying weight distribution. And so I casually brought it up with Harry. I said, Harry, I'm thinking about weight distribution and on the web. And he says, oh yeah, no question, get all the weight to the back. He says, you got to get it as light on the front axles as possible. And I said, thinking I'm clever, I said, I'm going to graphite the axles. He says, that's not a bad idea, but that's not going to do it. Let's go to the shop. So he says, Charlie, we're going to mill the axles. So here we put the axles in the drill press, and I've got emery cloth, and I've got 1,000 weight sandpaper, and then I thought we were done because we'd done this sort of thing. But originally he had set up the axle so that in a vise so that you could spin the wheel like this and see how long it would go before it would stop. He'd say, let's give it 10 more minutes. And then we had extended the time and reduced the friction coefficient, and it was so much fun to be doing this stuff with Harry, and I had no idea that he was a Pinewood Derby expert. So it wasn't just in rowing that he was competitive. In more than Monopoly, it was Pinewood Derbies. And so he said, let me know. And all of you know how this came out. Because in the first phase of it, Harry said, well, it'll look like there's no advantage until the second half, and it should take off. He said, just step out, like you have to use the bathroom, and get the graphite right there. The graphite's got to be fresh. And then my son was astonished because the car just took off in the second half. And it was the ugliest car there, but it was so fast. And so I said, Harry, the car's fast. He says, great. So, before I get collared for running over my time, I have just a golf story or two, because Harry loved golf. And I think he'd just taken it up in the fall of 1985. And there was a broom, probably, from a sweep, okay, in the shop, and he would swing it, and he'd swing it. And Joe and I were Joe Shea, our boatman, a great friend of Harry's, we were trying to find this broom because I wanted to show you how worn down it was over 27 years, how many swings he took. And he said, one day he said, Charlie, I figured it out. He says, it's the wrists in the middle. It's what Palmer used to do. And I said, well, all right, good. And I said, I called Peter Sherris. I said, you played golf with him last weekend. What's his swing? It's better. And I said, okay, good. I said, Harry, Peter Sherris says it's better. And he said, you're darn right it is. I can feel it right through the middle there. I found out recently why he admired Gary Player as a golfing professional, because Gary Player would squat 200 pounds 30 times, 3 reps the night before some of his greatest wins. And so he's in incredible shape. And I know Harry would think it's funny that Gary Player posed naked in some sort of a national sporting magazine. But anyways, I wish that had happened 5 months ago, because we would have had a real laugh about that. Now, a little controversial, well, and this is not as controversial as what comes next, but Harry would drive golf balls out of the bay. Okay? After he'd warmed up, he'd drive them out. So if I'm coming up the river in my launch, or if I'm riding a bike on the other side, you would see a golf ball emerge from the bay. And, and they usually land over there on the far shore, in the soft grass. And that would explain why you'd find Harry's launch pinned against the dock with the boat in gear, no driver in it. He's looking for the golf balls he'd been driving earlier that day. Now, one of the jobs of a boatman is to be everybody's foils, to have a little fun with the coaches. So Joe Shea, on his way home, would grab some of those golf balls and throw them over into the Kennedy Park. And now I didn't know this, okay? And I said, my God, Harry, I said, you're gonna hit somebody walking. And I said, and interestingly enough, he was unperturbed by that. So another moment in golf that draw your own conclusions about this was whenever Joe would play golf with Harry, or he'd get these invitations, and if you were south of Georgia, I would say, Joe, how did you guys hit the ball today? How did Harry hit the ball? I said, did he bother the alligators on the course? And Harry wasn't afraid of alligators. I don't know why he would bother the alligators, or why he felt compelled to poke an alligator. And Joe told a story at his memorial the other day of a 12-foot alligator. Joe said it had to be 1.5 feet off the ground at the tail. and Harry's ball had landed next to the alligator. And so he wouldn't change the position of the ball, and he's looking at the alligator, and he's positioning himself, and he looks back at it, and he takes some practice swings, and and the alligator's tail is almost coming around like this. So he makes his shot, he whiffs it, and Joe's watching him, and he says he looks annoyed, and he thought he was gonna hit the alligator. He said, "Harry, what are you thinking? This is an alligator." And then Harry thinks better of giving the alligator a whack. And then he takes a step, and then he goes, boink, like that. And the alligator exploded into the water. And everybody jumps. And Harry just winked at Joe and said, "Let's go to the next hole." Now, the last thing I'm going to describe is Harry's greatest moment in golf. And I was there. And I don't play golf. And it was in San Diego, in the airport, coming home from the San Diego Crew Classic. Okay? And we had rolled two unmentioned brothers from the California Bay Area into, along with Everett Abbott, we had rolled them into the area where we could get them on the airplane. And we're waiting. Harry's got his golf bags, and he has his hat. He wore a straw hat at the time. And, you can see he's a good-looking man with a tan, golf, the outfit. And I'm standing there, we're chatting. And he was approached by two women who said, "Excuse me, are you Greg Norman?" And he was thrilled by that.
I represent the 60s, and so I have to wear glasses now. Good afternoon. My name is Monk Terry, Jr., from the class of 1968. This morning's row was a terrific rowing tribute to Harry. And appropriately, I had a bifurcated row with one of my lightweight compatriots, Tougher Cutler, and two heavies from my JV year, senior year, Ed Porter and Pete Rogers. We also were coxed by the best-looking coxswain in the boathouse, Devon. As you know, was the first female coxswain operating out of Newell under Harry. I'm humbled and honored to be in this beautiful chapel to help honor and celebrate Harry's life. To Kathy, Abigail, David, George, Eleanor, and Eleanor and Harry's grandchildren, we all here feel your loss. And I hope that today and in the days and years to come, you know that we are and will be holding you close. I was instructed to keep my remarks to 5 or 6 minutes, and it's a hard act to follow Charlie and George. And I do have one golf story, but I think I'll leave that one alone, because I don't play golf either. This will be the only 6-minute piece that I've ever done for Harry that will not involve intense physical stress. I know that many of you have heard about or have already read Boys in the Boat by Daniel Brown. He's woven a wonderful story about Al Ulrichsen and the 36 Olympic crew. It also reveals, I think, the setup for Harry's becoming the Harvard head coach. For in 1960, Tom Bolles was the athletic director, and one of his coxswains from Washington was Harvey Love. And someone told me, it might have been, I can't remember who told me this story, but when Harry was the freshman coach, and Harvey had died in January or February of 1963, and Tom called Harry on the phone and said, "So, Harry, who would you like for your freshman coach?" And Harry said, "I thought I was the freshman coach." And Tom apparently said, I think you know. Harry's story is not defined, however, by one race or one crew, much as some of the crews that we know would like to think. But by, in fact, all the crews that have rowed out of Newell. His first decade is marked, I think, by Henley in 1959, when he sparred with the Grand and Tem Cups winner, both from Newell, and the Munich Olympics at the other end, when 6 of us, with Princetonian Pete Raymond, Wisco Tim Mickelson, and Quaker Gene Clapp, did battle in Munich. Harry's win-loss record in those years, 7 sprint victories in a row, was his trouncing of Yale, his boys' participation in Tokyo that you've heard a little bit about, and the Mexican campaign would have been enough to make just about any coach think that they had done it all. If you had told me in 1973 that Harry would still be coaching and that he would sweep Yale 40 years later, I would have said that your oar was definitely cracked. My daughter Louisa, who was in the stands when wife Kitty and my father were also there in Munich, when she was visiting in Miami, I received word that Harry was gone. When I told her, she burst into tears. And it was really only at that moment that I realized, and that it was brought home to me, exactly what effect Harry has had on the entire Terry family, from Big Monk, who was an oarsman class of 22, and my 4 grandchildren who happily met Harry last fall and actually rowed in the tanks. Since I've returned to row with the Alta Octa, the Munich crew, every year for the last 40, it's impossible to isolate the 60s experience without the flavor of seeing Harry with all his crews and being with them at special times out of Newell. Every year we saw Harry's crew rowing as Harvard or some other made-up crimson-tinged entry, showing us the promise of what might happen the following spring and summer. It was not that Harry promised us that we could win or that we would win. What he did promise us was non-verbally, of course, that if we delivered on what we knew we could do, we could individually, that he would put the right boat together and make it sing. The big question was, and I think it still is, well, how did he do that? What was his secret? Journalists and coaches tried in vain to get Harry to talk. He wouldn't, probably because he knew better than to talk to journalists, but I think also because Harry was a true introvert. But it was also clear that Newell was his boathouse, and it was the heavyweight boathouse, even though Harry was basically a lightweight at heart. So I have to say congratulations to Charlie, because after all, he's a lightweight, and he's going to continue that tradition. And just a brief thought, when I remember so distinctly showing up in 1964 as a lightweight at Newell, and we had a little dinky room, and the heavyweights had their own weight room, they had their own shower, they said, you can't come in here, and we were just like, forget it, go away, leave us alone. And they were big, too. What seemed sometimes to be rudeness or arrogance was only Harry focusing on the crew in front of him. How else could you explain getting waked by the SS F.L. Higginson with Paul Peters driving and Harry with his jaw set, his eyes glaring at his crew? There were other times when literally Harry said absolutely nothing. Pete Raymond, who coached for a while out of Newell as a lightweight coach, described Harry strolling into the office one day, the little tiny office that Charlie was talking about, that we all know well. He walked into the office, and Peter said, "Hi, Harry." And Harry sat down at his desk, stared at it, and did whatever he was doing for about an hour, and then left, said nothing. The next day, he walked into the same office, same scene, and said, "Hey, Pete, how you doing?" Go figure. My answer is focused. He never gave pep talks before races. There was no pep in his talk. Rather, he said something pithy like, I guess you're going to have to go out there and go for it. I think that's what he's. I think that's what he said in Munich. It's like, this is the, oh my God, one of the biggest moments of my life, and that's all he said. When it was clear that I could no longer row lightweights in the beginning of my senior year, I found Harry somewhere wandering around the boathouse, probably in the shop, where I now know what he was really doing. And I asked him, Harry, how do you, what do you think about my rowing for you? And he looked at me and said, sure. It's like, what? What did that mean? When Harry saw Charlie Hamlin and me perform a 20-stroke piece in Long Beach, because he hadn't paid any attention to us for the whole time we were out there with the 68 crew. And we were having a fine time, and we're rowing a pair, and we sort of knew that we were supposed to be doing something, but we didn't really know. And so Harry comes up to us and says, let's see this 20. And so we did a 20, and it was pretty good because we were rowing the boat really well then. And Harry said, oh, not bad. Okay, what did that mean? But what we soon found out was that Harry, even though he was pretending not to pay attention, was watching everything and thinking about everything, and you never knew, wherever you were, whether it was in the third varsity that definitely didn't get any attention, or the JV, or even a lightweight boat for that matter, you never knew when you were going to get plucked into and put in the varsity. Jim, too, can testify to that. You had to be ready mentally and physically to do whatever Harry wanted you to do. So they write and they wrote about Harry as the coach, as a teacher, the man who imported Carl Adams, spoon blades, Swiss boats, stadiums, ergs, and interval training. Harry was not much for accolades, as we know, and would always downplay his part in the rowing revolution of the 60s. I proffer that Harry was more student of the craft of rowing. He figured out his own apprenticeship because there was no formal training in those days, and he became more sensei and alchemist in some interesting combination. He never eliminated an oarsman based on size or erg score. Instead, he embraced all shapes and sizes and focused on creating fast crews. It's almost as if he could see what a crew was going to do. Harry was, as I remember him in the 60s, was particular, exacting, demanding, and sometimes irritable when he was doing this alchemy. He was clever, and he used foils, like using lightweights to make a point on the water. There was one time he cruised up to my lightweight boat and said, hey, guys, let's do a 20. And I leaned back and said, okay, this is our chance. We can do it. And we smoked him off the line, one length and 20 strokes. Harry threw his megaphone down and said, let's do that again. Of course, we got creamed. And but I figured out later, when I was talking to Perry Boyd in the great stroke from ¡59, that was really a setup. Harry knew what he was doing. He knew about lightweights. He was a lightweight. He knew exactly the game that he was playing. I had no idea. Harry also I think that he loved rowing because it combines raw and elemental power and endurance with grace and beauty. And he liked it because a race was final. You raced and that was it. But he really thought fairness was a very important thing to Harry, and he would fight for re-rows or seventh lane finals, as he did for the 68 lights at the sprints, as he did for our straight four in Long Beach, and as he did for the 8 in Henley in 1988. And that's the time when I discovered what the other Harry really was. And you've heard a lot from from George and Charlie. But that's a part of Harry that I never knew, because he was my coach. He was the coach. He was the heavyweight coach. And after the re-row, Kitty and I were in Henley, and we went up into town, and we ran into Harry and Kathy. And I was thinking, oh man, this guy is going to be really bummed out. I mean, we had heard he raced them twice, and the Tideway Scullers still won. And I had never been alone with Harry. It was always in a group thing when a lot of those large heavyweights took up most of the airspace. Harry got a kick out of all that, and as Charlie described at dinners, he would lean back, he would clap his hands like he was in kindergarten or fourth grade, and his laugh would sometimes come out of his gut, and he would chortle or guffaw and roll his eyes, and most of the time he would say, "Right, great," or as we heard, "Unbelievable." And nobody ever knew what that meant. Did that mean you're unbelievably stupid, or or that was really funny? Anyway, but in fact, Harry and Kathy, and so I thought, well, maybe we should sort of get out of here, but Harry and Kathy wouldn't let us go. And we had a delightful afternoon, which I will always remember, and it was really fun. And so there were a couple other times when I experienced the relaxed, funny, gleeful, and actually devilish Harry. He showed unbridled joy in doing physically demanding things and in being with family and close friends. As to the working Harry, the book written should be called Boys in the Boathouse. He loved each and every one of us. And as to the man, he was always at full pressure, and he showed us how to do that, and that it was fun. So to Harry, full pressure on this one.
Hello, my name is Ann Warner, and I was a member of the 1975 World Championship Women's 8 and the 1976 Olympic Women's 8, both of which were coached by Harry Parker. For those of you here today who are not intimately familiar with the world of rowing, all three of you, 1975 was the first time that the U.S. Women's 8 was selected on a national camp basis. That is, the boat included a variety of athletes selected from all over the United States, rather than just being the fastest club or college boat that year. And 1976 was the first year that women's rowing was included in the Olympics. I don't know who it was that had the historic foresight to ask Harry to coach the women's crews in 75 and 76. I suspect someone out there does know. I do know, however, that he brought a level of gravitas and excellence to the National Women's Program that indisputably raised it out of the morass of conflict that surrounded women's sports in the 70s. In 1975, Harvard was in the middle of its long process of merging with Radcliffe, and I was a member of only the fourth full class of women in a very fine little college down in New Haven. Much more importantly, all over the country, little pockets of women with indomitable spirits and enormous physical talent were springing up, bucking the centuries of male traditions and emerging as athletes in their own right. And despite the fact that Harry, like most of us during that time, was in the throes of a personal evolution, he nevertheless approached the task of forming that first women's team with the quiet dignity and sense of humor for which he was so well known to all who are listening today. Nothing anyone can say about that era will be agreed on by everyone who lived through it. That is the nature of social upheaval. We all experience it from a different vantage point. And I am both humbled and daunted by the task of trying to explain what Harry's contribution meant to the world of women's rowing in words that take into account all the prismatic differences of opinion that were the hallmarks of that time. But I can say one thing on which everyone will agree, and that is that Harry Parker provided for women's rowing the respect, seriousness of purpose, and dedication to excellence that put us on the map. So what did he do that was so memorable, or better said, transformational, with this first women's team? Well, the first thing he had to do was to find us. Harry traveled all over the country looking at different programs and clubs and schools looking for us. He went to Wisconsin and to Purdue, to the storied clubs along the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, and he even visited that extraordinary little college down in New Haven. And the women Harry plucked out of those programs for the first national team camp, and eventually for the final 8, were not the ones that many people expected to be chosen, for the simple reason that Harry used selection criteria that had never been applied to women before. He didn't choose us because we were the prettiest, though many of us were pretty. He didn't choose us because we were tall, though some of us were very tall. And by God, he didn't choose us because we were obedient. Because if any one thing could be said about the women in those boats, it is that each of us, in her own way, was a rebel. Harry's coaching had the simplicity that is demonstrated only by the most brilliant. There was only one quality by which Harry judged us, and I'll warrant that this was the same one that he used to select all 50-odd years of teams he coached here at Harvard, and that was our ability to move boats. His genius lay not in finding whose technique fit a certain mold, but rather in identifying the unique capacity of each rower to move a boat through the water with a maximum of efficiency, grace, and speed. All of which is not to say that either the 75 or the 76 boat was particularly graceful. To the contrary, we were the quintessential motley crew. We hailed from all different parts of the country. We were short and tall. Our techniques, if you could call them techniques, were, shall we say, various. And on top of that, we were racing 1,000 meters instead of the men's 2,000, a distance which, for the world of Olympic rowing, was completely new. Think the mile instead of the 5K in running, a different beast. But instead of trying to train us as he would train athletes at 2,000, but shorten it up a bit, Harry took the challenge of the shorter race seriously, studying the different training required and the different race strategy. And instead of trying to fit us into some existing mold technically, he took us just as we were, feisty, explosive, rebellious, and set us to the task of performing this new event in concert with each other. Perhaps most importantly, as much as he imparted his wisdom to us, he also listened in equal parts. He listened to our young coaches, whom he invited as assistants to the camps. He listened to us as athletes and tried, a little awkwardly sometimes, to address the particular challenges of being a female athlete. He even listened to our wee bit of a coxswain, a 16-year-old flea bite with a giggle who could stamp her foot and have all of us, including Harry, come to attention. He saw us, he heard us, he chose us, he respected us, he coached us. My favorite memory of Harry was from 1975, the 200th anniversary year of, what else? Independence. We, the American team, had traveled to Henley in the land of King George to put in our last days of training before going to the World Championships, which were to take place in Nottingham, England that year. People in the rowing world think of Henley as the vaunted site for the grand annual rowing party, complete with tea, tents, and fabulous hats on all the ladies, all in celebration of the rowing races. But during the 360 days of the year when the famed regatta is not taking place, Henley is a little fishing town on the banks of the River Thames. And if you want to coach a boat there in the off-season, you have to do so while pedaling a bicycle along the cow paths beside the river. One evening, a couple of us decided that Harry was getting entirely too serious and needed a little cheering up. So 3 of us slunk out of the hotel and crept down to the boathouse in the dark, carrying scissors and tape. And we decorated Harry's bicycle by weaving red, white, and blue crepe paper through the wheels, and by inserting playing cards that went thwack, thwack, thwack in the spokes when the wheels went around, and long streamers that flowed behind in the wind. The next morning, we, as usual, walked down to the boathouse at dawn in our short shorts and long legs, as the early fishermen watched us warily with eyes as round as saucers. We lifted our boat off the racks, carried it down to the dock, and shoved off as Harry went round to the back of the boathouse to get his bike. Then, as we sat there on the water, waiting to see what would happen, out comes Harry from the back of the boathouse, riding like a bat out of hell, with the streamers flowing behind him, acting for all the world as if nothing was out of the ordinary. And facing straight ahead as he pedaled along without even turning his head to look at us, he called out, "On the paddle." And for that entire practice, he rode that red, white, and blue chariot beside us, stopping only to avoid the cow patties and to open the gates next to the locks upriver. He never let on. As part of the planning for this service, those of us who were asked to speak today were told that Harry had commented on all of the speeches that were made on his retirement from coaching for Harvard by saying that actually, quote, they weren't talking about me, they were talking about themselves. And so I had to think carefully when I was planning this remembrance, am I talking about myself or about Harry? And here is what I concluded. The thing about Harry was, you'd think that someone who was a grand master of coaching 8-oared shells would be renowned for his ability to get everyone to do the same thing at the same time. But Harry's quintessential talent was not in asking us all to be the same, but in recognizing us each as a unique individual with unique talents and strengths. And then, by focusing us all on the single purpose of moving a boat, he brought us together as one. So it is fitting for each of us, in remembering him together, to think of those qualities in ourselves to which he gave his special nurture, and thereby to honor his life. Thank you.
Check it out, check it out. This is a game. Comparisons are made, choices are made. It is a game that was first played at Red Top in 2003 and was last played there, somewhat notoriously, in 2006. It is a game that I revived in a note that I sent to Harry when I learned he was sick. It is a game that I later learned he quite enjoyed. It is a game that we play once more in his honor. And so check it out, check it out. The likelihood that on this beautiful day, Harry is looking down on us from above, or the likelihood that having found spectating at his own memorial service too self-indulgent a pastime, Harry is instead having a quiet word with God about the consistency of the oatmeal that is available in heaven. Every morning that I spent at Red Top, Harry would arrive in the dining room for breakfast and go straight to the pot of oatmeal. Once there, a few exploratory jabs with a serving spoon allowed him to test the thickness, which, if found wanting, led him to storm immediately into the kitchen. Harry was a creature of habit, and because he was so beloved to us, those habits became the stuff of our lore and celebrated legend. And it is hard to argue with the oatmeal in light of how the race has played out over the past half-century or so. Thick oats make fast boats. But check it out, check it out. The total number of words spoken by Harry to the heavyweight crew in the entire month of February 2005, or the average number of words spoken by Harry during a single afternoon to a promising recruit. Now, to be fair to Harry, there are only 28 days in February. I was a walk-on novice, and so never experienced Harry's recruiting charm firsthand. It was not until my sophomore year that I witnessed him in action during a practice in which I started out in the launch, together with a particularly massive teenager. There was small talk. There was discussion of personal interests. There were jokes. Yes, the Sphinx of the Charles purred much like a kitten. The experience, of course, made me realize that Harry chose to be a man of few words with us. Like all of the best teachers, his method was deliberate. But check it out, check it out. More curious development in the later years of Harry's career. The appearance of his chin-strap beard, which in 2 words was pretty sketchy. Or the arrival at the boathouse of a small dog named Pikachu. The answer is definitely the beard. But I can tell you that there are few more bizarre experiences than in the middle of a piece in the old tanks, watching Harry scurry down the stern gangway after a miniature spaniel, calling, "Here, Pika Pika." While the constituency for the beard will always remain a mystery, Pika's pink collar betrayed that she was Abigail's dog, and just another example to us of how much Harry loved his daughter. Check it out, check it out. More memorable event on the dock at Newell. Walking out onto the patio from the Varsity Lounge one afternoon and looking down to the dock and seeing Harry, about halfway through his swing, hit a golf ball that I watched rise over the river and bounce twice on the far bank before I heard it strike a car stopped on Memorial Drive. Whoops. Or, when having heard the same distinct sound of ball on metal, Harry turned and began to hurry up the dock. Club in hand, and looking up and seeing me just before he passed into the bays, somewhat slowed and remarked, "Thomas, go inside." I have often poked fun at Harry for his love of golf, but that pastime, like his interests in cycling and cross-country skiing, and all manner of other non-athletic pursuits, shows the breadth of his many passions over the years. While we saw little of Harry outside Newell, his life and interests were far broader and richer than the sport of rowing, which, in perhaps a lesson to us all, probably explains in part the longevity and success of his career in the sport of rowing. But check it out, check it out. Harry's happiest moment on a Friday afternoon in early October, when, with 4 mixed eights charging down the basin at the end of a 3-mile piece, he would call out, "Last 10. Or when, after completing a long, slow arc away from the crews in his launch, Harry would slowly approach, and seeing a few heads raised up in hope of some reprieve, share with the fleet that we would return to Weeks. at full pressure. Given how wide he often grinned after sharing the latter news, it is a difficult question. Harry loved those fall racing days, which always provided heated competition and close finishes, thanks to how well Harry knew each of us and the squad as a whole, from its top to its bottom. He was, on those days, a master in his element. But check it out. Harry Parker, model of persistence or model of stubbornness? He urged me to be persistent just as often as he urged me to be stubborn, and the two are really opposite sides of the same coin. Sometimes, however, stubborn does seem more apt. A couple of years ago, my father and I joined Harry in the launch for the freshman race at Red Top. Driving down the course before the start, Harry noticed that one of the mile markers had drifted a few yards downstream. We drove up, and the three of us dragged the flag back into position. As we pulled away, someone in the referee's launch, someone wearing blue, suggested that it was improper for us to have interfered with the course. Saying nothing, naturally, Harry turned back to the flag and asked me to take hold of it. We dragged that flag almost 10 yards upstream. This time, the referee's launch was silent. Over the years, none of us have ever doubted who was in charge, but it was always amusing when someone else didn't understand. Check it out. Learning in the spring of my senior year that I had been admitted to the law school as I walked down the staircase in Newell, the place that I most credit for stealing me to the work that made the law school possible, or walking back upstairs and sharing the good news with Harry, the teacher who more than any other here provided the drive and inspiration that led to the happy outcome. Many of you were present last year at the Harvard Club in New York when Harry said that for him, the crew had always been about rowing fast, and that whatever lessons of perseverance or teamwork we may have taken from the experience were ones that we drew for ourselves from inner, though perhaps previously untested, wells of strength. I do not doubt him for a moment, though there is an important distinction between intent and effect, and I think Harry appreciated it. And regardless of whether he built fast boats out of which stepped better young men, or vice versa, I can tell you that Harry was thrilled for me when I told him that I would get to stay at the university for another 3 years. Which brings us to check it out. Spending the last 2 months following the hundreds of emails that have circulated amongst us in a moving and impromptu tribute to Harry's greatness, or standing here today at the spiritual heart of the university to which he gave his life, looking out over the human embodiment of that greatness, the legions gathered to honor their Caesar, and knowing that the very greatest men and women who have taught at this university are measured over the centuries not only in the lives that they touched while still living, but also in the lives that they touched long after they were gone. Check it out. Check it out.
Crossing the Bar by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Sunset, an evening star, and one clear call for me. And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea, but such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. Twilight, an evening bell, and after that, the dark. And may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark, for though from out our bourne of time and place, the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar.
Thank you, Abigail, for that beautiful reading. I'm batting cleanup, which has its advantages and disadvantages. I'm Joe Harvey from the class of 1989, and at that era, there were historians in our midst who helped us to see the strengths of the crews that preceded us. And so we were usually reverent toward our elders. But Monk, I have to correct you on one point that I wish I didn't have to correct you on. The race you referred to at Henley was unfortunately in 1989, and the crew was Notts County A. I was in position to know that. For most of my life since Harvard, I have worked in independent schools, and so teaching and learning have been my primary focus. It's no accident, I think, that increasingly the teaching profession has taken on the language and methodology of coaching. We learn best, it turns out, when we have authentic challenges, when we are responsible for the outcome, when our teachers do not deliver the lessons, but rather serve as guides. In 20 plus years in education, I've been fortunate to have worked alongside and been mentored by some remarkable teachers. But for me, the standard for exceptional teaching has always been Harry. And so I believe it is for many of us. In much of what we've shared with one another about Harry over the past months, one thread has stood out for me, that he was the finest teacher we ever had. Each of us has quite personal reasons to say that. One thing that independent schools offer parents is that their children will be known. Over my 4 years here, and in the years since, the Harvard teacher who actually knew me was Harry. I think that is true for many of us who rode for him while we were here. And right from the start, let's acknowledge that we assembled here, at least the Harvard-Oarsmen among us, are not necessarily the most coachable folks in the world. We believe at a very deep level that we are special, tougher, more stubborn, more driven, more competitive, more persistent. Sound familiar? Indeed, these are traits that Harry nourished, encouraged, brought increasingly to light through his work with us. But they are also qualities that have the power to make those around us miserable. Lionel Leventhal's infamous "speed first, safety last" comes to mind. And yet Harry somehow did more than just manage us or put up with us. He reached us even at our most stubborn. He saw us as we were, at our best and at our worst, perhaps because he was a not uncomplicated man himself. It is remarkable, really, particularly with the benefit of some perspective. As a teacher, Harry somehow was able to capitalize on this stubbornness to help us hone our determination so that we could rely on it, each in the way that we were able to learn it. It might actually have been easier to try to mold us in his image or in one image. And Anne, your remarks really echo my own thoughts on this. But that would not have been nearly as successful once we were off the dock, out on the race course, or, as many of us have spoken about, far away from Harvard and Harry himself. And I posit that Harry would never have considered that in the first place. He respected each of us too much. To Harry, respecting the individualism of each person was primary. Just as he held himself to his own standards, so he would never impose his standards upon us. Instead, and I think this is a crucial difference, he had his standard, and it was up to us what we would do. It's really interesting to listen to Harry's own words about this. Adam Holland posted online a video from the early 1970s in which Harry was interviewed about rowing. Here's part of what he had to say. The training program consists primarily of rowing. The more rowing you do, and the harder and the better, why then the faster you're going to be able to make the boat go in a race. But it's an excellent way for oarsmen to realize just how much distress the body is capable of enduring. He goes on, but the whole question of whether the year-long training and the amount of work required is worth it is pretty easy to answer. If it wasn't worth it, the oarsman wouldn't do it. And finally, one sort of difficult aspect of coaching that troubles me is trying to draw the line between your own personal ambitions and the ambitions of your oarsmen. At what point is the program geared to helping them achieve their goals? Or are you in fact striving to enhance your own sense of accomplishment and, in a sense, using them to help you do that? It's a difficult question because coaches are competitive with one another. It's that last part that Harry did so well. He removed himself from the equation. It simply was not about him, but rather about us, about our individual and collective ambitions for ourselves. That selflessness is so rare, and it is in part what set Harry apart from other teachers and other mentors. Thomas alluded to the dinner in New York 2 years ago, and for those of you who were there, I expect you remember these words. He was responding to the letters that he had received from us about what we'd learned at Harvard, and he said, "To me, rowing is about working hard to develop good rowing technique, to really become effective and to be fit enough and strong enough so that you can really make the boats go fast." And that's what I've focused on, quite frankly. I've always just sort of assumed that if there's something else out there, it's because of the sport. It's not because I've been preaching it. What you think you have gotten from me in terms of learning perseverance, diligence, good discipline, teamwork, learning to have faith in the people in the boat with you, being trustworthy teammates for the people you're rowing with, those are things you've learned from rowing. And I'm just very happy to have been part of the process. Those words have come to mind often since that dinner. And what resonates quite deeply is Harry's insistence on getting himself out of the spotlight, on not overstating or taking too much credit for his role. We can argue with him on that point, but certainly the statement reflects Harry's humility and his integrity. Not so far down the road from here, another prominent New Englander spent a few seasons on the water. I'm not referring to Tony Johnson or Dave Vogel or John Pescator or Steve Gladstone. I'm thinking instead of Henry David Thoreau and Walden. In Walden, one of the focal points for Thoreau is the notion of economy. And that word fits Harry as both a teacher and as a person in many ways. First, perhaps most famously, it fits his style of communicating. It is an understatement to say that Harry did not waste words. I once experienced this quite uncomfortably. As a sophomore, I went to Harry, and I'm not sure in retrospect exactly what I was expecting to happen, but I went into the office and said to Harry, I really want to contribute. I think I was asking to seat race more. I'm not sure what the goal was. And Harry said, "That's good, Joe. There just are people who want to contribute who are ahead of you." So he did not waste words. A more fundamental notion of economy. Thoreau writes, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms." And in those words, I think, is another clue to how Harry lived and taught. Simplicity, the pursuit of boat speed, the production of the very fastest crews he could assemble, the building year on year of a program that resembled Harry not as an individual, but that reflected the purity, the simplicity of his vision and focus. He set the standard for us. He held himself always to the very highest test, modeling for us to the very end how we might live. Somehow relentless and yet gracious at the same time, stubborn and caring, serious and full of joy, complex and yet purely focused, proud and wary of the spotlight at the same time, competitive but inclusive, and deeply respectful, as I've said, to every individual he encountered. I'd like to finish with a few more words from Harry. Several years ago, I wrote to Harry after learning that his own coach, Joe Burke, had died. Here is what he wrote in response, and true to Harry, it was brief. "Many thanks for writing on the occasion of Joe Burke's death. He was indeed a remarkable man and a very important person in my life. And as you suggest, he no doubt had a great influence on me as a person and as a coach, greater perhaps than I ever realized. I hope I have done him justice. Once again, in his humility and deep respect, Harry has shown us the way. It is almost too much to hope that we may do him justice, but it is worth our every attempt."
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. I want to start with a quick housekeeping note. To everyone here, please do not feel obligated to approach a family member and offer condolences. Quite frankly, there are just too many of you. So, if you haven't already, fill out one of the over 1,000 guest pages, and don't worry if you don't reach one of us. Know that we're honored that you're here. And before I jump into a couple of stories, I want to talk about two people who are feeling the loss of my dad more than anyone else, Kathy and Abby. Dad was a huge presence in their lives every day. As many people in this audience know, my dad was parsimonious when it came to praise. And so I want everyone to hear just how much my dad loved and appreciated Kathy and Abby. It will probably not surprise anyone that Dad took complete control of the treatment of his cancer. And that meant that Kathy was often in the dark on how his illness was progressing. Regardless, she did everything she could to enable Dad to live a reasonably normal life as he juggled coaching, family life, visits to Dana-Farber, and the effects of the treatments. Dad knew this lack of information was very hard on Kathy, and he told me on numerous occasions how appreciative he was of the selfless care she provided. Abby, meanwhile, did exactly what my dad asked her to, and that was she led her life. She worked really hard at school and was swimming and rowing and with her friends, and this allowed Dad to relax and not worry about her, and to be incredibly proud of her and her achievements, including being accepted at Harvard, where she's going to start as a freshman in 2 days. My dad loved Kathy and Abby deeply, and we all owe them greatly for enabling Dad to manage his cancer and his career simultaneously over the past 2.5 years. So, to my dad. Where's the champagne? I wonder how many of you have heard my dad say that, because every single time he set foot in Janet and my house, that was the first thing out of his mouth. Even before his body was fully in the door, a huge smile on his face, a clap of his hands, eager to share good times. And yet I'm guessing, because probably 95% of the people here are from the rowing community, that you might have other impressions of my dad. The Sphinx, the taciturn, intimidating, weird, and fiercely competitive legend with an aura and record of invincibility and success. But there was another side to my dad that I'd like to share with you. The smiling, risk-taking, always game person who filled a room with his engaging personality and inspired many to achieve more than they thought possible. Here's a story my dad loved to tell. He served in the ROTC when he was at Penn. Somehow or another, when he was on a ship in training, not in combat, he found himself without any real responsibilities. I'm not sure how he pulled this off, but he was able to roam the ship at will. And while doing so, he discovered a nook that no one else noticed, the highest canopy on the ship, way up on a tower. My dad would sneak up there at different times of the day, lie down, and take in the sky, and the birds, and the horizon, and sometimes even the stars. I love the image of my dad up there, being independent and rebellious, close to nature. Does it surprise anyone here that Dad fell through ice at least 3 different times? He obviously survived, but clearly those falls didn't quell his desire to go where others wouldn't, to test boundaries. Continuing the water theme, Dad loved to jump into water from heights, whether from the bridge at Henley after a win, or into the Colorado River from a cliff while rafting down the Grand Canyon, or more recently, from the top deck of a cruise ship while touring the Galapagos, while his grandchildren, all teenagers, were literally in a hot tub, watching the 74-year-old give a whoop of joy as he leapt off the dock. They looked at each other with their jaws hanging open, and of course, 2 seconds later, they all hopped out of the tub and followed him into the water below. We scattered my dad's ashes 2 days ago at Red Top, the training grounds for Harvard crews as they prepare for the Harvard-Yale race. And it was a nice but sad affair of family members and a few of my dad's dearest friends. Why Red Top? My dad loved being close to his crews. He loved to compete with them, using rules that always enabled him to win. He loved the primitive state of the living quarters. He loved having nature all around him. It was his favorite place, and he asked for his ashes to be spread there. And now for some dreams. A few weeks before he died, Dad shared with Kathy and me a dream he had where he entered Newell Boathouse, walked into the bays, and they were completely empty. No shells, no oars, just the racks. He walked out onto the dock, and it too was bare. When he told us this, Dad's eyes were filled with tears. Kathy and Dad and I knew what it signaled, that his rowing career was at the finish line. This wasn't a surprise. It was really sad, but he accepted it with grace and dignity. He finished a winner in many different ways. And finally, let me share with you a dream I had a week after Dad died. I dreamt of this service. In my dream, I was speaking as I am now, and Dad was there, physically there, right by me. He was happy and smiling and supportive, definitely having a good time. And this is the image I carry with me, that Dad is nearby, being positive, leading by example, having fun. And so I say to all of you who knew my dad, I hope you too will carry your own version of my dad with you, and that he continues to encourage you, inspire you, and help you to do your best and to surpass your goals. And if you want an easy way to be reminded of my dad, remember, he loved champagne. That's right.
Please be seated. I'd like to remind you that there is a reception following the service down on the shores of the Charles River under a tent that's set up next to Weld Boathouse, and you are all welcome to join us there. Let us be together in prayer. O God, the eternal presence, we give thee thanks for all those near to us and dear who walked in thy light, in whose lives we have seen that light, and at whose hands we have received the mysteries of thy goodness and thy grace. Make us glad in all those whom thou hast given us out of the world, who have faithfully lived and at the last have quietly died, who are now gone on before us to heavenly places. We call to special remembrance at this time, O Lord, thy many mercies to this thy servant Harry Parker, for all thy goodness which withheld not his portion of the earth, for ever-present confidence in thy guiding hand along the way of his pilgrimage, we give thee thanks. We bless thee for his affections in the home, for his children, and for his loving wife Kathy. We bless thee for his indomitable spirit, for his love of rowing and competition, for his years of dedication to Harvard, and for the many lives he touched. Remembering that he lived generously and fulfilled his service faithfully, may we now enter into his unfinished labors in the sure and certain hope that in thy good time thou wilt perfect the imperfect life and labor of thy children. O God, whose days are without end and whose mercies cannot be numbered, make us, we beseech thee, deeply sensible of the shortness and uncertainty of life. And let thy Spirit lead us in holiness and righteousness all our days, that, when we have served thee in our generation, we may be gathered unto our ancestors, having the testimony of a good conscience, in confidence of a certain faith, in favor with thee our God, and in perfect charity with our neighbor. O Lord, support us all the day long of this troublous life, until the shadows lengthen and the evening comes, and the busy world is hushed, and the fever of life is over, and our work is done. Then, in thy mercy, grant us a safe lodging and a holy rest, and peace at the last. Amen. I invite you now to please rise for our final blessing. God grant to the living grace, to the departed rest, to this university, this commonwealth, this nation, and the nations of the earth, peace and concord, and to all God's children everywhere, life everlasting. Amen.